is the time of the week we usually talk to Craig Stobo, and we are talking to him again today. One of New Zealand's leading business people, obviously, but also financial and political commentators, and he joins us now. Craig, lovely to have you on the show. How are you, mate?
Good afternoon, Michael. How are you?
Good. Where are you today?
I'm in sunny Auckland today, Michael. About to head down to Wellington, but time to talk to you and your listeners.
Good on you. Listen, let's just do a bit of uptake on where we are with negotiations at the moment. The suggestion by Christopher Luxon this morning is that we are in the final straight. And the suggestion yesterday by Nicola Willis, the presumably incoming finance minister, is that we'll definitely be having a mini budget before Christmas. Can I ask you, Craig, I mean, you're a sage observer of these sorts of things. What would they cover in a mini budget before Christmas? And why would you need one?
Well, the traditional cycle of Treasury advice to the government includes a half-year economic and fiscal update in December. I checked the Treasury's website this morning and there's no date for that particular announcement. So that could morph into the equivalent of a mini budget on the back of advice received from Treasury, which hopefully, if they are on the last straight, will be forthcoming soon. But the purpose of a mini budget is to reset priorities of spending and tax, and it might be in the short term or it might be over the course of post 100 days, to use National's plan analogy. So I think it has elements of a political statement. This is what we're going to do. I'm not so sure that it needs to reflect an update to the Treasury's forecast, because we had that in the pre-foo. But I think it's a statement of what they want to do. And it may be principled rather than granular, given that a lot of work is yet to be done on what the expenditure profile will look like or when tax changes may come in. So I think that's a political opportunity before Christmas to give a very clear steer around direction of the coalition, mind you, not just the national government.
It's just that I understand the first 100 days, and Christopher Luxon said, I've got an agenda, and I'm sure he's put that statement in front of David Seymour and Winston Peters in the negotiations, and probably wouldn't find too much objection from them either, I might say. But it's just that a budget tends to change, a mini budget. You correct me if I'm wrong, Craig, but that would sort of stop financial spending in the financial year for which it's planned, this is the current one, and substitute it with some other priorities, wouldn't it?
Yes, so you can imagine expenditure, albeit in the round, on things like Lake Onslow. So we're going to stop doing consulting work on that.
Right.
We're going to change other priorities, for example. So you kind of give a very sharp update on what that could look like. Whether they've got time to do all that work between now and an announcement in mid-December is questionable, but it might be, as I said, a series of principles around where we would like to go. And unusually, despite all the discussion by Nicola and Christopher around the tax introductions they wish to bring in, it's actually, when you look through it carefully, it's not actually in their first 100 days.
No.
So they'll need to say something about directionally what the coalition is now going to do in terms of tax, because, well, you'd appreciate this. It's not just personal, but companies, firms need to know what the tax outlook may look like in order to plan. So providing some certainty will absolutely help in the way business adjusts to the new environment.
Is there any indication amongst the business sector in New Zealand as to what you think the travel is going to be, or are you as much in the dark as the rest of us?
I think I'm in the dark. We don't know exactly what's going on inside hotel rooms in Auckland between the three leaders. We don't know how they'll prioritise their three separate, agendas that they brought to the public and got voted in on that basis. We don't know the weightings or the priorities or the timing. So we're all in speculation mode, but we have a sense of direction that we've discussed before around some things that are common, and whether they get traded off for other things, we just don't know enough yet, do we?
No, I don't know that we do. That said, the suggestions, well, again, it's all idle speculation, I guess, but can I just read to you also, though, that Christopher Luxon says, he said this morning that the negotiations are in their final stages. He's also poo-pooed some of the media reporting this week about that trip that the two leaders took from Auckland, and apparently Winston Peters was there. He said Winston Peters was never intended to be there. It's just ridiculous reporting, and he's had a real go at that as well. The media are moving into speculative stage. I guess, given the fact that nobody's talking to them, that's all they've got left, is it?
Well, they're in a vacuum, aren't they? So if you're employed as a political writer, it's a difficult time.
What do you do?
Because the politics are in the shadows, and it seems pretty clear that none of the parties involved want to talk to the media at the moment, and nor should they, I think, while they're in discussions.
You and I have talked before about National's tax policy. You regarded it as, I don't think you went quite so far as to call it a fraud, but you certainly say that it was seriously flawed. Obviously, that's a view shared by both David Seymour and by Winston Peters. And yet, at the same time, you know as well as I do, Craig, they've got to produce tax cuts out of something, because it is such a central part of their election campaign. How do you see that playing out?
Well, I don't think Winston Peters will support foreign buying of housing in New Zealand. It just doesn't suit his nationalist agenda. I think those who are inflation hawks, or those that are concerned to be able to drive inflation down, will be concerned about the propensity for sellers of homes at, let's pick a number, $1,900,000, can't find a buyer in New Zealand. I raise the price to $2,001,001, and suddenly I've got 10,000 buyers happy to buy at that price and pay 15%. So you can see the possibility of inflation, can't you? And so it's a fool's paradise of a tax regime. So they have to go to other mechanisms. The second crutch for the tax plan by National was to stop the tax deduction for depreciation on commercial property that we spoke about before. Now, I'm sure the Property Council is lobbying very strongly to stop that move. So you then say, well, where do you draw opportunities to reduce taxes? You have to go to the expenditure side. And they have said that they're going to ask, or at least National has said they'll ask chief executives for a 6.5% reduction in expenditure to come up with some plans. But it's not just about policy analysts sitting on seats in Wellington. It's about the programs, the welfare programs, the education programs, the health expenditure. And that is very hard to change straight away, but well thought out redesign, potentially in collaboration with the private sector who can help with execution, will drive down some costs. Whether they've thought all that through in time for a mini budget, or indeed the announcement of the coalition plans, I'm not so sure. But we certainly need direction, which kind of leads to the conclusion that the tax cuts won't be happening in the new year, will they?
No.
They'll be happening as a forward indication at some stage over the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I agree with you. I can't see those tax cuts coming at any time. The budget will come out in May next year, won't it? I guess that's when the detail of when and where and how much will be released, do you think?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, there are existing pressures in the Treasury or government accounts. I spoke to you briefly about that last week. $150 billion of gross debt, up over $2 billion since the pre-fill in September. The interest costs of our borrowing were $2 billion in 2021. The forecast is $8.2 billion for this financial year, 2023-2024. And the assumptions and the forecasts were based on a government 10-year interest rate of 4.7%. But as of today, that interest rate is 5.1%.
Wow.
Which is why I said the pressure on our finance costs indicates to me that we'll be in double-digit figures fairly shortly, as in terms of billions of dollars, which is opportunity forgone for assisting with Hawke's Bay recovery or with redirection and education or whatever it needs to be. It's a dead weight cost, isn't it, of that borrowing that we've got. So it's not just about expenditure, it's trying to reduce the principal on our borrowing before it gets to the $200 billion number that the previous or the current Finance Minister, Grant Robertson, forecast in 2027, 2028. So, these are not short-term issues, they're reasonably long-term that needs good quality thinking to reduce the pressure on our borrowing. And that won't be happening before Christmas.
No, we'll get Craig back. Sorry, that was entirely my fault. I managed to switch off my unilaterally. And Craig, just to explain, that was my fault. I was talking to myself, which I have to say is usually an experience I quite enjoy because I know that I'm talking to somebody who's listening. But it is also very frustrating if there's somebody else on the other line. Craig, that was my fault entirely. I was talking away to you. I didn't have my microphone switched on, so I apologise.
Oh,
mate, the question I was asked... Thank you very much. No, I was actually having a very fascinating conversation with myself. Do you talk to yourself at all, just quietly, Craig, when you're going for a wander or something like that?
I may do in my sleep, but I never know.
Oh, really? Okay. No, I have some very intelligent conversations. Not happy with some of the replies sometimes, though, I have to be honest with you. Listen, I was just asking you, obviously to myself, so my apologies. I was just asking, we know that New Zealand First and ACT and National see eye to eye on many of the social policies that are out there, and we know that from just a simple look at their election policies. But in terms of economic policy, as distinct from fiscal policy, on economic policy, what do you see as the major differences, the things that you think might be holding up coalition conclusions now?
Well, I think there's a very strong structural reform agenda in ACT's economic thinking, from the Reserve Bank Act to the way services are delivered and the removal of entire departments of state. National, more centrist, more refinement, more reduction of expenditure of the status quo, and Winston Peters not silent, but more interested in opportunities to spend money on things that are important to New Zealand first, and that's road and rail links to Northland, and it may well be he's aiming for another version of the Provincial Growth Fund, which I'm not sure that Christopher Luxon should agree with, because he's gone on record as stating that he's not in favour of corporate welfare, and that will be a bit of tension. So Winston's has tended to focus on the expenditure side in economic thinking, as opposed to considering taxation issues per se or structural reform issues. So that's kind of the landscape between the three parties.
They all seem to, well, at least ACT and New Zealand First, seem to distrust the Wellington bureaucracy and have uttered that during their election campaigns. And there are already suggestions from government departments. MB, I noticed one, I think you used to be involved in MB at some stage. MB is one, but also other departments are starting to anticipate a change in direction. Is that normal? I mean, you've been in government departments. Is that normal to actually start anticipating change before you get instructions?
Yes. So those policies at National and ACT, for example, those policies supported for change by ACT and National, for example, repealing Three Waters, repealing Lake Onslow, removing the income insurance idea from Labor. Those will be unwound, so professionals in the departments will already be rethinking what they need to advise the incoming government on how to execute on those issues. So they'll be working now. They won't necessarily have, obviously, a mandate to go ahead, but they know that the wind has shifted, don't they? For sure.
I suppose that's a good thing from your point of view as well. How do you think that in your neck of the woods? So, yeah.
Well, one of the things is, you look at the number of ministries we have. I don't know if you know the number, Michael, but how many ministers do we have in this government? It was something that was reassessed by the New Zealand Initiative in one of their papers earlier in the week. The number of ministers we have relative to the size of our population and our needs compared with Australia or at a federal level or even Germany, we have an enormously large number of ministers. Why do we have the Minister of Racing? You know, what is the purpose of that minister? You know, really? Would we be better off with 30 ministers focused? And then you have a minister who has, in New Zealand, 4 different portfolios that may not even be related to each other. And so the poor person, the minister sitting in the office, is having to deal with disparate issues that are unrelated at any one point. You kind of think, why do we have this sort of system? Who designed this 5-letter course?
Yes, and I guess every minister means that they've got to have a ministry. So there's an infrastructure that supports each one of those ministers, yeah? Yeah, but there is don't hold me to account on the number, but there's probably at least 20 ministries inside the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. Oh, I see what you mean.
I mean,
yeah.
There's that issue, in addition to the number of portfolios a minister might have who sits in veteran affairs and racing and, I don't know, pick another one, immigration.
Yeah.
Some are in Department of Internal Affairs and some are in MB and some sit somewhere else. It's extraordinarily difficult even for the heads of department to be able to coordinate work programs across different sectors of the economy for different ministers. It just seems Byzantine.
Yeah, no, I listen, I hear what you're saying and you're absolutely right. It seems madness. Listen, and just on that, you and I have opined before about Wellington being quite different to the rest of New Zealand, and I think, couldn't have had a more dramatic representation of that than in the election results themselves. At what stage does Wellington get dragged back into the mainstream, or has that horse bolted?
I think that's a great question. Wellington is one of those places. It is the place in New Zealand that's very sensitive to the beehive and politics. And to be on the edge of a distribution curve, on the edge of a spectrum of possibilities, is quite difficult in Wellington. There's a very strong core which is looking at each other and holding hands and waiting for instructions from above. Very different to the regions, very different to Auckland. So one of the key issues that ACT has been looking at, and is somewhat supported by Christopher Luxon, is looking at the role of central versus local government, or the role of localism, where decisions at the periphery, issues at the periphery are best handled by those who are at the periphery. So if you've got issues in disasters in Hawke's Bay, the first people to respond in Hawke's Bay are locals. It takes ages, 3 to 4 days, for the government to come to the party. So how do you give more revenue, more responsibility to the regions, which is a very different approach to the current and exiting government, which has been highly centralising. Polytechs, DHBs, water, those are all looking to be centralised. And you could argue today that in the case of the Polytechs and the DHBs, the cost and the improvements to people using the system has not been demonstrated. And the argument is it's going to take some time. Well, I would like to challenge that it will ever get better outcomes for students of polytechnics or for patients in our hospital system. And the costs of that bureaucracy are higher than was the case under previous decentralised arrangements. So if you were to do that, you'd be thinking that Wellington would be a very different place, because the decision-making will be closest to where the issues are, so that people in Southland or Kaitaia can get access to resources to solve their problems of their communities without having to ask permission of Wellington. It's a very different New Zealand to what we see today. It was the case under the old provincial government system, way back in the 19th century. So we are a highly centralised economy. Lots of decisions made by a small number of people in Wellington, with the executive power through the cabinet and parliament being very, very concentrated in, I would guess, 3 people. The Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister and the Finance Minister are probably the key decision makers across many issues, across many sectors in our economy. And if they get things wrong, we don't have any ability to recover with diversification because of the concentration of the risks that sit around those decision makers.
Whether so does that account for the reason?
Sorry.
No, carry on. I was just going to say, does that account for the reason that that we have a bureaucracy that's become in the last 3 years much more ferocious, not simply in its sway over many issues, but also in its cultural outlook as well?
Yeah, so I recall a report written by Heather Simpson, co-authored by Heather Simpson on the Ministry of Health, around its lack of connection economically, socially and culturally with New Zealand over its decision-making, for example. What would be a first step to moving away from a highly centralised model of decision-making is contestability of ideas. So the willingness to embrace alternative ways. Alternative ways. So if we had more diverse opportunities to hear people speak at the beginning of the pandemic, we might have had very different outcomes to today. If we had more discussion around our university systems, our DHBs, our polytechnics, rather than one size fits all, we might get better decisions. And so how do we get contestability into advice to ministers?
Oh, I think that's the key question. And I think it's a question I've asked my entire life, well, sentient life, and that's over 50 years now, Craig, that how do you, in actual fact, argue against a government department that has 24/7 access to the minister and controls the information flow going into that minister's office? Because that's the issue, isn't it?
Yeah, well, you can do that quite easily by way of transparency. So if there was a requirement for advice to be transparent, that would be one way of handling that, so the public can see what was being given as advice to ministers. Secondly, you'd be very careful about who else has access, wrong words. If we had more transparency around those who were lobbying ministers on behalf of private sector or other interests, that would also be useful. So how do we produce transparency on the communications that are going to ministers? That'd be a good start, and then move into contestability. But what we need to celebrate is the friction and the heat of different ideas that are given to ministers, and have the public debate. And the ministers can see then where the weight of public opinion is moving, rather than through what is at the moment polling done by governments to understand where the public might be on certain issues, which tends to follow the public and doesn't lead the public. I'd much prefer the contest of ideas, and I'm sure you do as a debating aficionado. You know, where are the ideas? What are better ways of dealing with things? That's the richness of it.
Yeah, and also testing ideas too. So, well, but the other thing is testing ideas. If I was just to use education, and the curriculum is a good example of that, the Ministry of Education coming up with the revamp of a curriculum, let's just say it's history for want of a better phrase, and Craig then testing that with people who are not necessarily in government departments and saying, will this work? I mean, we don't get that from any government department, really, do we?
No, and I'm always wary around media, mainstream media, or anyone of a particular ilk saying or referring to an expert. You know, an expert.
Yeah, that's the other one too.
With issues that they've built up over their lifetime. A novel issue is very hard to address by an expert. So it's surprising the number of people that do have very good ideas on different issues. They're not experts per se in the field, but they are people that can read and write and think for themselves and ask good questions. That's a very valuable contribution to the curation of good quality policy.
No, you're absolutely right. Craig, thank you very much for joining us again. It's been an absolute pleasure. Catch you next Thursday. So that is Craig Stobo.
Thank you. Bye now.